Great. Well, good morning, everybody. This is, I think, one of my earlier talks that I've given over the last couple of months. So you get me when I'm nice and fresh as an ornithologist. I like early mornings, so this is good. And before I want to get started, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. I'm going to be talking about a couple of the research projects that Gary mentioned, especially this new paper, Humanity for Habitat, but also a couple of other really key projects that have really kind of shaped the way I look at the world. And so you will see the work that I'm presenting today is really a reflection of these collaborations. But let's get into it. So this morning, we're going to have a talk about the birds and the bees, but I don't want anybody to start squirming in their seats. It's not going to be that talk, but rather talk about these types of birds and bees. And when I think about the birds and the bees, as Gary mentioned, I'm an ornithologist by training, and I also dabble in bee research as well. I like to think of them in terms of some of these ecosystem services, because I think this is a really powerful way of communicating why these animals are important. So for example, on the left, we have a picture of a chickadee, and my colleague, Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, he painstakingly counted the number of caterpillars a single clutch of chickadees brought to their nest to raise their young, and estimated it between 7,000 to 9,000 insects just for one nest. So when we think about the number of chickadees and multiply that across the landscape, our chickadees are doing an incredible service for us. Otherwise, we would not have any leaves left because the caterpillars would just wreak havoc over them. And then in terms of bees, why do we care about bees? Well, one of the reasons is that if we like to eat, we need bees. And it's been estimated that bees provide a $56 billion ecosystem service in terms of their pollination. So as gardeners, I know you are all really familiar with the importance of bees. And these aren't just honeybees. Our native bees are also performing some really important pollination services as well. And I'm not just thinking about the ecosystem services of these animals. I also just genuinely love birds and bees and wildlife just because of what they are and who they are. But I recognize that ecosystem service frameworks can be really important for trying to get people excited about these species as well. And the problem is, though, we can sum up what's going on with habitat with this picture here, with this New Yorker cartoon. And I could really kind of have this entire talk be kind of this doom and gloom, but that's not really my personality. I'm a much more hopeful person. I like to think of these opportunities, recognizing that, yes, I'm afraid you have humans, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But let me just give a little bit more background. And so here I have two different pictures that I think really kind of sum up what, at least I grew up in Eastern Massachusetts, in terms of my experience of going into the woods. And I see these more pristine woodlands that you see here on the left. And then I go back to these same areas a couple of years later, and lo and behold, I see these nascent developments as we see on the right. And so my colleagues and I will kind of classify the one on the left as habitat and the one on the right as non-habitat. And we know from hundreds of studies that habitat loss is one of the driving factors that's leading to significant declines for birds and bees and other wildlife and biodiversity in general. And so there's a recent paper in Science back in 2019 that estimated that there's 2.9 billion fewer birds now than there were in the 1970s, and then also fewer bee species since 2006. And because of these losses and other losses, we're in this biodiversity crisis. However, one of the things to really consider is that when we look at the picture on the right in terms of this non-habitat, one thing to remember is that when the bulldozers leave and people move into these developments, we have these novel habitats. And so it's habitat loss and alteration. And because of this alteration, the promise, the potential of these yards for planting, I like to think that there's hope. So this, again, going back, I'm a hopeful person, I'm optimistic, and I like to think about some of these solutions to this biodiversity crisis. And the place where I spend most of my research are in yards, backyards, front yards, side yards. And as a wildlife ecologist with the US Forest Service, it might seem like a strange place to spend my research career. But when we think about the amount of land that is under residential development as classified as yards, in our recent bioscience paper, we estimated that as roughly 30% of the United States. And so to put that into perspective, I have another figure here on the left. It's 7 times more land that's classified as protected. So there's a lot going on and a lot of potential. And the other thing that I want to point out, even though I'm mainly focused in urban and suburban areas, that this is an urban, suburban, and rural component of ecology and conservation, because we have yards in our urban areas, we have yards in our suburban areas, and we have yards in our rural areas. And I have a few figures up here in terms of the number of yards. There's a lot more yards. There's roughly about 75% of all of our yards within the United States are in these urban and suburban areas. But in terms of the amount of land, it's about 75% that's located in these rural yards. And so yards are everywhere, but the majority of them are in the urban and suburban areas, but the majority of lands are in these rural areas because they're just bigger lot sizes. And the reason why I do get excited about yards is because there is so much potential for them. There we go. There is so much potential for them to provide habitat. Sorry, my computer's going a little crazy. There we go. It's because of all this landscape variation. And here's where gardeners and landscapers come in, is that we have all of these different choices to make when we're figuring out how we want to design these landscapes. And the big component of my research is really figuring out the science behind these different landscape factors and how wildlife responds. And so I'm really focused on providing that science to inform management. In other words, if we build it, will they come? And really testing that will they come component. And so today I'm going to share a couple of different studies that really kind of quantify the importance of residential yards for providing habitat for biodiversity. And so I'm going to highlight these 4 studies on birds and people, food webs, bees and lawns, and birds and designs. But before we get started, I just want to make sure everybody is awake. And I asked Gary to help me out with doing a couple of quizzes this morning. And so here is your first quiz. I would love for everybody, and there'll be a poll in a second, to let me know which of these images is Boston and which of these images is Phoenix.
You ready? So look at those, Boston versus Phoenix, and you're going to pick your choice. So just click on whether you think which image you believe. There we go. Great. We'll just give this a minute. We're up to about 2/3 of the people, Susannah. All right, you're up to about 80%, Susannah. So why don't you go from there? Can you see the, oh, I need to tell you the results, right?
You can see the results.
Okay, well, it's interesting. So the results are somewhat split. Most people think Phoenix is on the left and Boston's on the right. And, but it was 47%, 36% think the reverse, and none of the above is 17%. So the majority say Phoenix is on the left.
Okay, let's see. My computer is being slow today. Uh-oh, you're all waiting with bated breath. Let's see, hold on. Did it go? Let's see. There we go. So the 47% were correct. So we have, but I think the fact that we didn't get 100%, I think really makes this point, is that I could have showed these aerial views of cities from anywhere in the United States, and it'd be pretty tricky to figure it out. I tried to select images that had swimming pools in both pictures, so that wouldn't be a giveaway. But as we know, Boston is not really a grid. It's a little bit chaos, and Phoenix is very much one of those gridded cities. So that could have been a key component. But basically, a city is a city is a city. Wherever we go, we have these very similar forms within our cities. And what we're finding as well is this idea of this homogenization of our bird communities. And so within all of these cities in Boston and Phoenix and Miami and a whole bunch of other cities across the United States, Provincetown, out here in Springfield, we're going to have pigeons, we're going to have starlings, we're going to have house sparrows, and we're going to have a lot of them. And these are birds, these cosmopolitan species are found all over the United States and all over the world. However, when we go from this bird's eye view to a worm's eye view, we actually see a lot of variations. So this idea of this heterogeneity. So here's part 2 of your quiz. So Miami on the left, Phoenix on the right, or is Phoenix on the left and Miami on the right? So here's part 2 of your quiz.
Hello.
All right. So same thing.
Hi, Linda. Thanks for getting back to me. Yeah. I'm sorry that I didn't notice it. It's a part of my house that I don't go into all that often. So when I went in yesterday, I noticed that the frame was split. There's like a 1/4 inch split.
Susannah, I may mute everybody and you may need to unmute yourself again.
Putting it right around the window where they place the sill and the nose, and it's almost could have happened in the so I don't know what to do. I might have.
You're muted, but Julie Jones is not muted.
Oh, very well. Yes, I would.
Gary, you're muted. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Myself. There we go. Sorry. Phoenix, the majority of the people said that Miami is on the left. 85% said that Miami is on the left. And this one people were much more certain about.
Okay, well, this one is a trick question. And so these pictures are taken about 10 miles apart from each other. And when I was just finishing, let's see, this was about 24 years ago when I first started working in cities, and I was working in Phoenix. And I noticed that there's a lot of differences when you just started driving around in terms of the way people were landscaping their yards. You have these yards on the left that look like it could be Miami, it could be Massachusetts, minus the palm tree. And then you have these yards on the right that look very more typical of a desert landscape. And it's because of this variation that I became really curious that I see these differences, but do the birds see these differences? And so for my PhD research, I worked in Phoenix as part of the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project. And I was able to address this question of getting at how we're landscaping these yards and do the birds notice these differences? And so I worked within 40 different neighborhoods scattered throughout the entire city and the entire metro area. And the yards were located along kind of an urban to rural gradient, but also a socioeconomic gradient. And so as Gary mentioned, my first degree is in American history. And so I have this social science part of me that is very curious about how people are interacting with nature, as well as how birds and bees and wildlife are interacting with habitat. And so I really wanted to understand a couple of different things. One was what birds are located in these different neighborhoods. What are the types of plants that are in these different neighborhoods? And then what types of people are in these different neighborhoods? And how are people interacting with nature in these neighborhoods? And so that represents these 4 different components that we're able to do. And this is work with Paige Warren for my PhD research. And so went to all of these neighborhoods, looked at all the birds, counted them, looked at the vegetation, and then all of these sites were co-located within a US Census block group. So we got a sense of the socioeconomic status of people, and then asked a bunch of different questions in a social survey. And so what we found was that when you have these mesic type of landscapes, yards that had lots of non-native species, a lot of turf, water intensive, that you had these exotic and generalist bird species. Your pigeons, your starlings, and your house sparrows. Whereas when I looked at these neighborhoods that had more of these native desert types of plants, like the saguaros and the palo verdes, we saw an increase in abundance of these iconic desert birds from the Sonoran Desert. Species like Gambel's quail, cactus wren, and yes, greater roadrunners running across the road. These are birds that you're never going to see on the Cape. You're never going to see them in Massachusetts. You're not going to see them in Miami. These are birds that are very unique to these different desert types of landscapes. And so what this research really demonstrated is that when you plant desert plants, lo and behold, you have desert birds. Now, I know this might not seem that surprising, but this was actually one of the first studies to actually test this idea that if we plant natives, do we get native species? And so again, going back to this idea of providing the science to inform management, I think is really key when we're trying to promote people to plant these desert plants and native plants for wildlife. In terms of some of the patterns in terms of people, what we found is that neighborhoods that had a higher abundance of lower income percentages, a higher percentage of renters, and predominantly Latin neighborhoods, we again saw similar patterns as these music yards, that an increase in these exotic and generalist birds like the pigeons, the starlings, and house sparrows. Whereas in these neighborhoods that had a higher percentage of higher income, owner-occupied, and predominantly white neighborhoods, we saw an increase in abundance of these desert birds. And so what these results really demonstrate is that there's this unequal access to these desert birds. And then the question remains, though, is do people really notice this? Do people care? I know I do, because I get extremely excited even now, even after 30 years of seeing cactus wrens. I just love seeing them. Every time I go to the Southwest, hearing that cha-cha-cha of a cactus wren, it's just magical. But I just wanted to know, am I unique in that sense? And so working with our social science colleagues, there's been a survey, the Phoenix Area Social Survey, that's been administered to these same 40 neighborhoods where we've been collecting data on the habitat type and on the different bird species that are located in these neighborhoods. And so what we were able to do is to match data from people in terms from the data from these social surveys with the actual birds that we recorded in these neighborhoods. And there's a whole bunch of different questions in this social survey, but one of them asked respondents what was their level of satisfaction with the birds in their neighborhood. And what we found is a really strong relationship. So another way to read this figure is that in neighborhoods that had more desert birds, people were a lot more satisfied with the desert birds there. And satisfaction is another measurement of well-being. And so this is really trying to get at some of these aspects that desert birds are related to well-being. And what it really kind of demonstrates is that people are noticing birds, or at least we think they're noticing these birds, and neighborhoods that are good for people are also good for these desert birds and biodiversity. So that research was all at that community level, like all the different types of species that are present. And so the next component study that I want to highlight is research from Desiree Narango and her colleagues in the Washington, D.C. area that looked at these food webs of getting beyond who is there to how are these birds doing. And I'm going to sum up her dissertation in one slide, which took her many years to finish up. So I don't want to minimize the amount of work that went into this, because it's a really exciting study. Because I think one of the things that I liked about it is that it really took what we were doing in Phoenix and took it up to this next level. And so what she found by chasing around chickadees in the DC metro area for a number of years is that when you have more native plants, you have more caterpillars. So remember when I mentioned caterpillars and chickadees at the beginning of my talk, like they need a lot to raise their young. And chickadees prefer these native plants. They're going to spend more time foraging on native plants because that's where the food is. And so these two components are really exciting aspect, again, really providing that science behind the importance of native plants. But then the other component of our study that was also, I find kind of the most exciting part, is that these native plants are stabilizing populations. So in other words, if you have at least 70% of your plant biomass as native, then there's going to be replacement, so that the chickadees, their populations, they're going to be stabilized. And when populations are stabilized, they're not going to tank in terms of and have those negative implications for biodiversity loss. But again, the thing that I really like about her research is that it provides this number, this 70%. And so it's not 100%, which I think sometimes can be really challenging to get at, but it's also providing kind of these benchmarks for gardeners and landscapers to aim towards. Okay, so we're going to leave birds for a few minutes, and I'm going to talk about bees and lawns. And I'm really excited that you are going to be talking more about lawns later on in the year. So again, hopefully this will provide a little bit more context to what you're doing on the Cape. And so why do we think about lawns? Why should we care about lawns? This number, 163,800 square kilometers of lawn cover the United States. What does that mean? That seems like a big number, but what does that actually mean? And so that's roughly the size of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. It's a huge amount of area that's being irrigated, mowed, and fertilized. And so these are extremely high maintenance landscapes. And again, it could be these daily irrigation, weekly mowing, or seasonal fertilizer application. And because of these manicured to the extreme types of landscapes, some of my colleagues had this to say about these lawns, as calling them biodiversity deserts and relatively useless for birds and bees. And this is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I remember during my dissertation defense, when I was talking about the work that I did in Phoenix, I had a question that said, what's the best thing we can do? And I said, get rid of all our lawns. Everybody clapped and passed my defense, and I moved on. And then the next year, I started thinking about that. And I kept coming back to this number of 163,800 square kilometers. And I realized that was an impossible feat to get rid of all of these lawns. And so I came up with this new mantra, like, how do we make our lawns less bad? And I feel like that kind of sums up a lot of the work I do, recognizing that our cities and suburbs, our backyards, they're never going to be these pristine habitat that has been replaced, but they can be less bad. And so I started thinking a little bit more about lawns when we moved into, we bought our first house, and we now were responsible for lawn care. And I remember there was one season where it was my husband's turn to mow, and he had gone out and he had done this very interesting pattern of mowing. Rather than doing kind of the up and back and forth rows, he did this patchwork, and there's all these different bits of the lawn that were unmowed. And I thought that was a little strange. My husband's from England, so I thought maybe it was something like a Britishism of his, or perhaps our son had left some trucks out in the middle of the lawn and he was just mowing around them. And so I went outside to investigate. And when I got closer, I realized that he had mowed around all of these different flowers. And although we're both like massive birders and wildlife enthusiasts, we just didn't have time to be planting wildlife habitat or planting flowers. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. We have our own flower garden that just came up. And then I looked down, which is also unusual since I'm usually looking up as a birder. And I noticed this buzzing around. And I looked closer and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's an eastern bumblebee. And it was at that moment that I had one of those aha moments that scientists really do have, and started thinking about our lawns, our lawn care, and lawn mowing and bees. And what I realized is that every time we mow, we have this potential where we are taking away habitat. And so these lawns are these social ecological systems. They're these, the social system in terms of our lawns and our yards in general are an extension of our home. And the primary reason why we do what we do to our yards is for aesthetics. We want them to look nice, and not necessarily for us, sometimes to appease our neighbors. But these actions that we have these ecological consequences. And so with that in mind, I designed this, this hypothesis that tested this idea that if we mow our lawns less frequently, would we have more lawn flowers? And these would be like your dandelions and clovers and violets, etc. And if we had more lawn flowers, would we have more bees? And so I pitched this idea to the National Science Foundation to conduct this study in Springfield, Massachusetts. They agreed, gave me some money, and went off to select 16 different yards in Springfield. And so here's one of our typical yards that we worked in. And so I want you all to notice that they're nothing special. There's no vegetable gardens, there are no pollinator gardens. We really wanted to highlight yards that were predominantly these lawn-dominated systems, these lawn-dominated yards. And because I'm a natural historian at heart, there's two components I wanted to get at. One was just the basic habitat value of these lawn-dominated yards. Are they really biological deserts? And then two, really wanting to get at this management aspect of that. If we mow our lawns less, that management activity, does that have any implications for bee habitat? And so there is a number of different considerations that people that partook in the study had to agree on. They were not allowed to irrigate or fertilize while we were doing the study, or apply any sorts of pesticides. And the other thing, though, that we were mainly interested in was the amount of mowing and the frequency of mowing. And so yards were set up into three different categories. They were either mowed every week, every 2 weeks, and every 3 weeks. And I just want to take a moment to explain how challenging it is to conduct experimental research outside of a laboratory. And it's even more challenging to have experimental research in people's backyards. And so you really, the main component of having experimental studies is that you want to try to control as much as possible. It's pretty easy to do in the lab. You can sort of do it out in like the forest or in deserts. It's almost impossible in people's backyards. But so we did the best that we could. But the one thing that we really wanted to control was the frequency of lawn mowing. And the only way we knew we could control that was to provide free lawn mowing service over the course of 2 years. So on a side note, we mowed a lot of lawns. It was the equivalent of pushing the mower from Springfield all the way down to Philadelphia and then back again. This yard here in the top left corner, this was a yard that was mowed every week for the 2 years. And I think we clocked about 75 miles just going back and forth and back and forth. So when we think about some of these ecosystem services of lawns, if we are the ones who are pushing the mower, we might be able to get some exercise in there as well. And if they're electric mowers or non-engine mowers, even better. But let's get back to the study component. And so as a reminder, the first part of the hypothesis is if we mow our lawns less, do we have more lawn flowers? And so one of the things that still I find a lot, well, there's a couple of things that I find extraordinary. So I'll tell you the first one is the number of species that we identified in the lawns. And so what we did in terms of the study, every couple of weeks we would go out and we would identify and then count the total number of lawn flowers that were growing in the lawns, as well as other types of flowers that were in bloom. There were always a handful of other ornamental plants, and we really wanted to figure out what was going on with these lawn flowers. And we identified at least 58 different species that are growing spontaneously in the lawns. These are in the seed bank. And again, these are 16, just within 16 different yards. And here I have our 10 most abundant and most widespread species. And yes, the bees, we did recognize some, or we did document some of the bees that were actually using these different types of flowers. And lo and behold, similar to if you plant desert plants, do you get desert birds? That was very confirmatory science. We also found a similar result here on the right, which demonstrates that if you mow less frequently, there's more flowers available. So again, this is kind of a, well, duh kind of science, but again, providing the science for those management recommendations is really key, because up until this point, no one had actually gone out and measured this. And so our first part of the hypothesis, okay, it's supported. We mow less, we have more lawn flowers. But what about the bees? And so we identified 111 different species of bee that were hovering around in these yards. And so I want to put that into perspective. We looked at one land use type. We looked at lawn-dominated systems that had very few pollinator-friendly types of plants. And this 111 species is roughly a quarter of all species that have been recorded in the entire state of Massachusetts. So again, like, we didn't look at any forests or meadows or wetlands or any other types of habitat, just one type. And Joan Milam, my collaborator on this project, who is our taxonomist, this was her first time working in backyards. And every time she would find like a new county record, she would just come into my office like, oh my gosh, we got another one. And she got so into them. And again, it still astonishes me, again, looking at the types of yards that we looked at. So this bee that I have here on the right, Lasioglossum ilioense, it is not very exciting, I know. However, this bee, which is about the size of a grain of rice, was our most abundant bee that we collected throughout our study. What's interesting about that is that the last time Lasioglossum ilioense was documented in Massachusetts was back in the 1920s, and it represented only 2 individual specimens in the eastern part of the state. And so this got us kind of excited. Massachusetts is a very well surveyed state in terms of knowing what types of bees are where. And so we did some genetic work thinking maybe we have a new species. It wasn't. This is a species that's very common further south. And so what we think might be happening is that by looking in places that people had previously not investigated, we were documenting this northern movement of this species. But lo and behold, it was very exciting to share with all the residents where we were doing the studies to let them know there's this rare bee, even though it's very common further south, but this rare bee in their neighborhood, they got a kick out of that and they got excited. So in that sense, that was pretty cool. But in terms of the different types of bees that we identified, I just want to take a moment just to drool a little bit about the beauty and the magnificence of these species. So this is just a handful of some of the species that we documented in these yards. And so just to take note of the colors, the metallic greens, the sizes, the hairiness of them, their ability to carry pollen. There's so much diversity and so much beauty. And I recommend if you have an hour or 2 or 3 to kill, just Google Sam Droege, USGS. These are all of his photographs, and has the most amazing photographs of bees in these from these microscopes. So just give you a second to enjoy these. Okay, but going back to our hypothesis, if we mow our lawns less, we have more lawn flowers, but do we have more bees? And so the answer is, well, sort of, and it's complicated. And so we did find that bee abundance increased with an increased abundance of lawn flowers. But as you'll notice here on the second figure of the bar chart, it's the weeks that were the lawns that were mowed every 2 weeks are the ones that had the highest bee abundance. And we did all sorts of modeling and statistics, and this is a part that just took us a long time. And every time, every different type of model, we kept coming up with the same results, so that gave us a lot of confidence that the bees were responding to the abundance of flowers. And we also noticed that there's a few species that really dominated the bees that we were observing in these yards. And these are what we call these workhorse species. So in terms of pollination and bee abundance, this might be a really good combination here. But we kept coming back to, well, why didn't we see more bees in the yards that had more flowers, knowing that the bees were responding? And there's a couple of hypotheses that we have. The main one is that, like the Lasioglossum ilioense, most of these bees are about the size of a grain of rice. So in addition to these yards having a lot more flowers, they also had taller grass. And so this taller grass, we think, might have made it a little bit more prohibitive for some of these really small bees to access the pollen and nectar, therefore making these yards not as ideal and optimal as the yards that are mowed every 2 weeks. Regardless, one of the things that we're having worked on this study is that this was a much easier sell to get people to start mowing their yards every 2 weeks rather than 3 weeks. And so, for example, when we would get to the yards that were mowed every week, the householders would come out and they'd wave to us because we were there all the time. We were there every week. And usually the yards, they didn't really look like they needed to be mowed, but because it was part of a study, we wanted to keep up with the protocol. When we got to the yards that were designated as the 2-week mowing regimes, those are the ones who were like, well, I think it needs it. And we'd give it a trim. And then the yards did look a little fresher and a little bit nicer after we finished mowing. And then the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, when we pulled up to the houses for those yards, the householder was already running down and meeting us at the curb, helping us to get the lawnmower out. And they're like, I'm so glad you're here. My neighbors were getting really upset, and they kept offering to come over to mow my lawn. And they told us that they told their neighbors, no, my yard is part of a science experiment. But what this tells me is that people just are not ready to let their yards go. And so here's another opportunity to try to provide habitat for bees that also acknowledges the aesthetics.
Cutler.
So going back to this question, are these biological
Right.
deserts?
Thank you.
Could someone?
I'm looking. Yeah, I'm looking, Susanna.
Okay. Yeah, I just like I get here. So going back to this question, are these biological deserts? And so if it were up to me, and I think probably a lot of you on this call, I wish our yards looked something like this. But I also know that yards like the one on the right, they take a lot of work. They take a green thumb, they take money, they take time. And for some people, they might not like that. And it might just look a bit too messy and too chaotic. And so in addition to planting these pollinator gardens, what we're suggesting is that we also do less. We become what we call this lazy lawnmower. It's economical, it's time saving, and it's simple. And here's an opportunity for everybody to participate. And so I know for me, like everybody's telling you, like, you have to do this, you have to do that to save the bees, to save the birds. What if we start saying, you know what, why don't you do less? Like that resonates with me. And from the popularity of this study, I think this resonates with thousands, if not millions of people of having another opportunity to contribute to conservation. Okay, so we're gonna head back to birds and we're gonna talk this fourth study about birds and landscape designs. And this is a study that we looked at across 6 different cities across the United States. And this is a project called the American Residential Macro System. And basically what this study does is kind of take the work from Phoenix and the work from Springfield and just kind of blow it up and looking at a whole bunch of different components. And so we looked at birds, we looked at bees, we looked at ground arthropods, and then also there's a whole bunch of other people that are looking at soil, looking at plants, looking at people. It's this monstrous of a project. And my component of it is I've been leading the wildlife research, but today I'm only going to talk about the birds. Because this is the study that we have already out. And to give a little background of this research, we looked at 4 different typical types of ways that people are landscaping their yards. So we worked with the National Wildlife Federation with their program, and we identified yards that were wildlife certified through their program. And then we also identified yards that had some sort of water conservation. And so these would be yards in the east, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Boston, Baltimore, and Miami that had some sort of a rain garden. So some way of taking the water off of the system to keep our basements from flooding. Whereas our 2 arid landscapes in Phoenix and Los Angeles, these would be xeric landscaping for water conservation. And then we also looked at yards that had high management lawns. So these would be yards that had fertilizer application and that were heavily managed and maintained, and then these low management lawns, so similar to the yards that we worked in Springfield. And then we wanted to look at how the bird community was responding to these different types of landscape design. So this kind of goes a little bit beyond the native versus non-native plants that we did in Phoenix. And in addition, we also wanted to look at kind of these more wild types of plant communities and systems. So we looked at 2 different types of parks. We looked at some of these natural areas and then these unmanaged parks as well. And so within all of these different types of landscapes, we went in and we looked at what the bird community was doing. And what we found was that in the yards, we compared yards and parks, we found that there was more species, more types of birds, and there was also a lot more of these non-native species in these yards. That was not too surprising. In terms of having a lot more species richness, that's primarily because you have a mix of some of these native bird species and these non-native and generalist species. Whereas in these natural areas, we found a higher abundance of species of high conservation concerns. So these are the birds that we've been losing at more accelerated rates. We also found a higher abundance of insectivores, so birds that are eating insects, and a lot more of these native species. So these results weren't that surprising, but we were we hypothesized that if you have these wildlife certified yards that were trying to provide habitat for wildlife, that the bird community would be a lot more similar to the parks that we saw as well. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at bird communities. And so by just looking at numbers is just one component. And another way that we looked at it was this idea of turnover. And so what we did find when we looked at turnover within each city was that these wildlife certified yards were in fact behaving more like these parks. And so here I've color coded everything. So you have the wildlife certified yards and you have these little humps and these bumps. And so you might be looking like, well, what does this mean? Like, how do I read these figures? And so another way to look at this in terms of when we think about turnover is this way. Say we have a wildlife certified yard and we go and visit one yard and we look at what bird species are there. We see a cardinal, we see an American robin, we see a pileated woodpecker. Pretty cool. Those are nice species. And then we go to another wildlife certified yard and then we pick up 2 new species. There's a wood thrush and there's a black-capped chickadee. All right, that's kind of cool. And then we go to another wildlife certified yard and then there's another new species. There's a catbird that's lingering around. Very cool. And then we go to a 4th yard and then we pick up another species, a yellow warbler. And so what the point here is that if we increase the number of wildlife certified yards, because there's so much variation in the way people are landscaping, but they're still providing kind of key components for habitat, then we have this opportunity to provide additional habitat niches for different species. And so this idea of turnover, the more yards that we have that are landscaped as wildlife certified, then we have this opportunity of having more species. And so that part is really cool. So this is kind of this idea that these wildlife certified yards are they're not homogenizing the bird community. Whereas when we have these yards that have the high management, what we found is that you go to each yard and it's basically the same species. You have your pigeons, and here I'm talking about grackles, were very common, and house sparrows. And so by continuing to have these lawn-dominated, high-intensity, high-management lawn systems, what we're going to see is this homogenization of these landscapes. So another way to look at the way that we're landscaping and that in terms of these landscape designs is that when we have these wildlife-friendly, wildlife-certified yards, they do in fact support higher biodiversity for birds, and that they are performing more similarly to these parks than they are to these other types of yard designs. And so within this birds and designs idea, there's been a lot of talk within the conservation world about these ideas of land sharing or land sparing. And so whereas you have on the left, land sharing would be what we do in our yards. We're sharing the yards with wildlife. Whereas this idea of land sparing, you've set aside parks and then you develop everything around it. And so these are 2 different conservation strategies, and both have their value. The ones on the right for parks are really great at supporting species of conservation concern, whereas the ones on the left are really good at providing habitat for some of these popular backyard bird species that bring us joy. But I'd like to point out that it doesn't have to be a land sharing or land sparing, but rather a land sharing and land sparing, that both of these conservation opportunities can really provide habitat for wildlife, and that both of them are really important because one really kind of brings people along and the other one really supports some of these species of conservation concern. Okay, so I've mainly just kind of hopefully convinced you all that our yards really provide habitat for biodiversity. But again, going back to how I describe birds and bees from those ecosystem services framework, I know that that just talking about the biodiversity benefits might not be relevant to everybody. And so I want to mention some of these other advantages of having our yards as habitat. So the first one about advancing climate resiliency. So a simple way of looking at this is that if we have more trees, we have more habitat. So that's what our research has demonstrated. And we know that the wildlife are responding to more trees or more flowers in that sense. And so what we found from these are 2 other studies that I'm highlighting here. I was not part of these studies, but in general, when you have more trees, you're going to have drier basements and you're going to have cooler temperatures. And so these other services that our trees are providing, and so highlighting these synergistic benefits as well. And so this is a really important component when we're trying to promote more habitat. There's all of these additional benefits for us. And our yards as habitat can also advance well-being. So similar to, as I mentioned earlier about the level of satisfaction in birds, what we also know is that there's more habitat, more wildlife, but there's also been research that has demonstrated that these yards are actually more aesthetically pleasing. And so when we're again thinking about these landscaping choices, that's number one. We want to make sure they look nice. And then there's also this opportunity for us to have these stronger connections with nature. And so there's been research that shows that there's when you can recognize more bird species in your yard, that you have the stronger connection. How do you get more species? By having more biodiversity friendly, ecological friendly, wildlife friendly types of landscaping. Okay, so this is all great and everything. However, there's plenty of barriers, but because I'm optimistic, there's also these opportunities. And I just want to highlight a few of these pretty quickly. So first of all, as I've mentioned many times this morning, is that there are these social components. Our landscapes are these social ecological systems. And so again, they have to look nice. So these could be some of these barriers. And then also we have to adhere to these social norms. So as I mentioned before, it's not necessarily, we might not be landscaping how we want to do it, but how we think our neighbors want us to be landscaping. And so there's a whole bunch of different opportunities for us to really demonstrate what we're doing is out of, there's a purpose and it's not necessarily neglect. And so Joan Nassauer from the University of Michigan came up with this idea of these cues to care by having different types of signage that can demonstrate, yes, this is intentional and it's not neglect. There's a couple of other components. We also have recent research that came out that showed partnering with gardeners, with master gardeners, can be kind of that gateway towards getting master gardeners who are already into their gardening to have it be a little bit more wildlife friendly. And so that's another opportunity as well. The second component is the economic barriers, and transforming your lawn into some of these pollinator habitats or wildlife friendly, it can be cost prohibitive. It costs money to buy new plants, to completely take out all of your lawn and replant it with prairie plants wherever you are. However, there's again a lot of these opportunities. A lot of city and statewide programs have these rebates. The one I want to highlight here is in Minnesota. They have their Lawns to Legumes program. These are bee lawns, and they provide a financial rebate program where you can seed your lawn with different types of flowers for bees, and then you get a rebate. And finally, there's a lot of these different policies out there that make it prohibitive for us to landscape the way that we want to. And so, for example, there are these local weed laws that tell us that we can only have our vegetation at a certain height or else we're going to get fined. And then also, for the most part, our yards are not part of the conversation for conservation. And so one of the things that we have been doing is seeing this change in local, revising local ordinances. I've been a part of 2 cities in the state of Wisconsin that have recently changed their weed height ordinances based on some of the research that we did in Springfield. And then also I'm highlighting here Executive Order 14008. So this is the Biden and Harris initiative of 30 by 30. So protecting 30% of the US lands by the year 2030 for climate resiliency and biodiversity. The only way we're going to get to that number of 30% is if we start considering these private lands, these backyards. Okay, we're almost to the end. So I've mostly focused on the individual backyard, but I have to highlight that our backyards are part of a larger system. They are not an individual island. And so here I've kind of highlighted the way that this works is that if you follow the nest here on the top panel where that the yellow star is, and then you follow it down to the neighborhood to see where it is. So it starts off as eggs, and then it goes into the nestling stage. And then these yards are part of these neighborhoods, and then these neighborhoods are part of these cities. And so at that third stage, that fledgling stage, so that these animals are dispersing out beyond that individual yard. And so when we're thinking about our landscapes, we have to think beyond the individual yard. We have to think at these broader scales that our wildlife are using, because they don't know these backyard boundaries. And then the other thing that I hope has come through to my talk is that there's many different opportunities to engage. And so it's not a one size fits all. And that's what I find very exciting. So there's the low mow lawn. So if we tell people, like, you know what, be the lazy lawnmower, hey, that's great. Or if you want to do a little bit more, you can plant some flowers in your lawns to have these be lawns, or reduce the amount of lawn that you have and plant more flowers. And that importance of scaling up and telling your neighbors and putting up signs and getting more people involved. And so I have kind of these main components. If we take away anything from this talk, plant your natives, garden for wildlife, mow and manage your yards less. And then I really want to highlight, so, I'm going to do like a little bit of name dropping. So back in October, I was on All Things Considered and talking with Scott Detrow. He asked me a question like, is this a moment or a movement? Because we're talking about lawns. And I like to think that we are moving towards this idea of a movement because people are talking about what can we do for our yards. I've been in this game for about 25 years. And over the last couple of years, I've been getting increasingly more and more invitations to share the work that we're doing because people are hungry to know and to hear about some of these other opportunities. And the idea of using our yards for habitat isn't new, or just to use them for something other than these social systems as these extension of our homes. So while I was an American history major, I focused on World War II. And so when I was thinking about how I wanted to frame the work that I was doing in backyards, I kept thinking about these victory gardens from World War II. And so as we know that they were addressing food shortages due to high enlistment of farmers, and so providing food habitat for us, this is kind of the same idea, but with this idea of humanity for habitat, instead of providing food for humans, for us, we're providing food for wildlife as well. And this is really an extension of the work that some of my colleagues back in the 1970s started, actually in the Amherst office, Jack Ward-Thomas and Dick DeGraff, two really prominent wildlife biologists, got their start, really were foundational in the urban ecology, urban wildlife research with this publication from 1973, which really spearheaded the National Wildlife Federation's certification program. So I like to think that I've just kind of taking off where they left off back in they stopped working in these this kind of research back in the 80s. But again, this whole idea that it's all hands on deck when we think about humanity for habitat. And so kind of the main component is that when we do something like manage our yards for wildlife and plant all these native plants, we have an opportunity to see something. And when we have an opportunity to see something, hopefully we also will feel something. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, and of course, a thing called love. And so with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Susan. Susannah, excellent presentation. It's great to have the science background to support your findings. A lot of this we've heard. Many of us were at the our spring symposium yesterday, and I think it's just echoing a lot of what we heard yesterday, but backed up with your science. Everybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I'll start with a couple so you have time to type, but please go ahead and add your questions into the chat. Susannah, I was struck when I saw this the first time, and then when we've been talking, I wonder again. So in the 1970s, which was a big time of environmental change and recognition, the Forest Service saw all this, had that charming poster. How do you feel that here we are 50 years later, and we feel like we're presenting this as new information to so many people? What's your take, or what's the, are we just repeating science over and over again? Are we talking to a new audience? What are the challenges in your mind about why we're still fighting this fight?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember when I moved into my office in 2011, so it was the same office that Dick DeGraff and even before him, Jack Ward-Thomas, where they had their office. And so I found all of their old papers, and actually I found a speech, a talk that Dick DeGraff was going to give, and it was all, it was typed out. And so these were his remarks, and I read it, and I think it must have been from 1974-ish. I was just trying to kind of figure out, because he had some references in there. And when I was reading, I'm like, wow, this could have been read today. And this 10 years ago. And so there's part of me that, yes, is a little frustrated. However, I think that what I've noticed is that change takes time. And that I think it's what happened back then in the 1970s was just kind of the shift of ideas in terms of wildlife management. And so up until that point, it was when we thought about wildlife management, it was always out in the forest, out in the grasslands, not in these residential landscapes. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, people are starting to talk about these other potential wildlife habitat areas. And then throughout the 80s, a lot of the urban wildlife research was really focused on conflict. And so in terms of interactions with coyotes or interactions with deer. And so what I noticed then was it was very most focused, like, how do we reduce the conflict? And then kind of seeing this kind of shift again, but again, people are talking about, well, there's wildlife. Why are they here? How are they related to different types of habitat type? And then continuing to see, like in the 90s and the early 2000s, there started to be this shift of really kind of looking beyond just how wildlife were doing in cities, but then also looking at how people were interacting, and not just from that conflict perspective. And so again, seeing the shift of, okay, well, how do we get these attitudes in, and how do we celebrate wildlife, and how do we recognize that there are some species that just bring us a lot of joy? So I think the research has really come a long way from over the last 50 years, whereas before it was very focused on, like, it was very typical wildlife management type of research questions. Now we're starting to see questions where people are looking at race, people are looking at attitudes, they're looking at how people are interacting, what people are doing, recognizing that it's not wildlife management, it's human management. And so yes, it's a little frustrating. And also, like I mentioned, I mean, I've just had so much interaction with the press with the recent research. So people are starting to think about it. And I think maybe we've just gotten to that tipping point.
Great, great. Speaking of what's changed since 70, one of our participants says, you explained that since 1970, 2.9 billion birds are gone. And since 2006, there are 25% fewer bees. The stats you used, are they based on the North America, continental US? What kind of, because we've heard this worldwide, it's not, I've often commented, it's not just the US, the world is experiencing this. But what was your research?
So those were not my studies. Those were other people's studies. So the bird one, that's all North America, and that's based on North American data. So over the last 50-ish years, so there's two main bird monitoring programs that are nationwide, and also in Canada. So there's the breeding bird survey, and so it's data where people are going out and they're counting birds on these different routes scattered throughout the United States. And so they're able to use those data from the late 60s and to look at these trends over time. So it's a really powerful data set. It's all citizen science. And then the insect one, I think that's a global one. The bee one, I think that's a global one. And so I think it's a combination. I think we need to have these localized studies to really get at the fine scale of what's happening. And then also there's been several studies that have really looked at that global scale as well.
Good. All right. I'm glad Judy asked this question about how high did you mow the grass? And in the 3-week, when I heard you talk about this before, I don't know whether this was something I was just thinking about, or did somebody ask you and you responded to it? With the 3-week, other than the homeowner feeling like it was getting too high because they just have a lawn, their intention is not to have a meadow, they wanted a lawn of some sort. Did you find that part of why the height became more of a factor is because there's only so many flowers and they sort of get lost in the height of the grass? So is that part of why there was a middle ground that seemed best, and how high was that?
Yeah, so let's see. I have the numbers somewhere in terms of the height of the grass. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I think, let's see, if I remember, I think it was maybe like 11.2-ish centimeters for the 3 weeks, and maybe about 8 centimeters. I think it's in one of the publications.
Oh, okay.
And so we did see a difference. And so one of the things, so as you mentioned, like, I'm a wildlife biologist, but I learned a lot about lawn maintenance and lawn care over the course of this study. And so we set the mower at it was like height number 2. And again, I can't remember, like maybe it was at oh gosh, maybe 3 or 4 inches. Again, it's in the study. I don't remember the numbers, but we kept the height the same for the entire course of the study. But from reading turf magazines and looking at extension agency websites, like you're supposed to only remove about 1/3 of the blade of grass every time you mow, in terms of that health of the grass. And again, in terms of the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, even though they had taller grass, again, they had more flowers. So I think again, like another component is that the way that we did our sampling is that, so this was, we would be going out and collecting bees in these bowls. And so perhaps because there's so much, like, and these are artificial, like, ways of kind of luring the bees in. And maybe the other component is that the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, because there's so much flowers, they're like, well, we're not going to go to that, that artificial patch because there's so much around. So there's a couple of reasons why. If someone wants to give us another, more funding, we can kind of look at some of those questions.
Great. Okay. Lots of interest in the signs and where, particularly like the lazy mower sign, and there was QR codes. We will have Susannah's presentation's been recorded, and I can follow up with her. I also have interest in getting those. But are those signs, just if you know this, Susannah, are they available for downloading if I go to track down those sites? Is that something, or are they purchasable, or what's the story?
So actually, Gary, I sent you a message right before the presentation in the chat. Maybe it didn't go through.
Oh, okay.
Let's see let me see. I might be able to, let me see.
If you can send it to all.
Let me send it to all.
Okay.
So let's see if that works. There we go. All right, so everybody in the chat, I just put in a link to the bioscience publication that I talked about that documented the extent of yards, and also where you can see this lovely poster that we have on the left. And then there's 2 different links in there for you can download these lawn signs for free.
Great. All righty. We will, to everybody, we'll get some of this information available easily for everybody to see. Thanks, Susannah. One other question was about bird feeders. A couple of people asked about bird feeders, and as an ornithologist, what's your take on using them, time of the year for using them, value of using them, ecological distribution or disturbance? What's your thought?
I love this question. So, and I always answer this question with a question. So when somebody says, is it okay for me to feed birds? And then I say, well, it depends. So I think there's a couple of different things. It depends on where you live. So if you live very close to like one of these parks, these more wild areas, then you might be changing up the bird community a little bit. So I know Mass Audubon, they have pretty strict guidelines in terms of when to feed birds. So feeding them over the winter, and taking your feeders in. Well, I feel like now it's earlier and earlier, just so we don't have issues with bears, is one of the key components. The other thing, during the summertime, usually there's so much available wild food that's a lot more nutritious for our species, for our birds, so they don't really need it at that point. But if you live in an area where, in the suburbs, chances are you're not going to have that much of an impact, either positive or negative. But if it brings you joy, then I say go for it. And I think for a lot of people, we're feeding birds more for us than we are for them. And recognizing that, again, where you're located, like the bird community has already shifted so much in these urban and suburban landscapes. And so by us putting up a feeder to bring in our chickadees so that we can dazzle at them as they're kind of flicking around, or looking at cardinals in the middle of winter when it's just so dark and there's all the snow out there, and all of a sudden you see this bright, ruby colored bird, go for it. So that's there is research that shows, if you're going to do that, make sure you clean your feeder frequently. There's especially with house finches, so there's they can transmit diseases through sharing bird feeders. So conjunctivitis is a big thing that can be transmitted through feeders. But the other thing to keep in mind is that if you have a bird feeder and you have an outdoor cat, or there are outdoor cats that are roaming in your neighborhood, not good. So to think of it this way is that like you're inviting birds into your yard with these feeders, and then the cat's like, wow, this is awesome. I'm just gonna go and kill them all. And I can say that because I've got my two indoor cats that keep us company. They do not go
Yes.
outside.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Quick question. I don't know if this is cowbird. Is there such a thing as a cowbird? Is this meant to be a catbird? Do they eat Japanese beetles, the emerging Japanese beetles, or is that a food source for birds?
So I don't know specifically, but I
Okay.
wouldn't doubt it. I mean, a lot of these species, they'll have kind of their core food items, but then other, like sometimes it's just whatever's around. I know that there has been some research of outbreaks of spongy moth and birds. So the spongy moth is formerly known as gypsy moth, a relationship with that and bird fecundity. So in terms of success of their nests, there's also been some research that's really linked. So the emerald ash borer is another insect that's devastating trees, especially in the Midwest. But when you have a lot of these emerald ash borers, there's like an increase in abundance of woodpecker populations. So good. There's some, again, it's not like we want to have these invasive species for the birds. Like there's plenty of other food around, but there's research that shows that they are taking advantage of it.
Like cats, do we give hawks easy prey easy food source when we have bird feeders?
We do, and so you'll see, you'll see, especially like birds will be going kind of crazy, and then all of a sudden, if you notice, then they'll like stop. Yeah. And then sometimes there might be like a little, and then normally, like if you look up, then there's probably like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk that's just ready to take them down. So again, like you want to be careful about what you're doing. And the other big component is that if you have a bird feeder, make sure it's not too close to your window. So in addition to cats killing billions of birds, so window strikes it's also a huge problem for birds. So we mostly think, when we think about window strikes, a lot of times we think about these high-rise buildings in like downtown New York City. But there's also been research that show that even though you have kind of the most extreme cases of these really tall buildings, it's the 2 to 3 story buildings that are actually having the biggest impact because they're so widespread across the landscape in terms of birds. And so what happens is that birds they see a window, and if you have a window that's like on one side, and then it looks like they can kind of fly through, they don't really see that there's a glass there, or if there's a reflection on that window glass, they'll think, oh, well, there's more habitat. And so they fly into it. Sometimes they only get stunned, but a lot of times they die. Yeah.
Kate Eldred, do you want to unmute yourself? You said you had a question, Kate? Is that true? No? Okay. All right, I see you shaking your head no. One last question about moss. Any research feeling on moss with shady grounds? Did any of your research talk about moss versus grass?
Nope, we haven't looked at that. I mean, we did look at, one of the things that we did look at was the amount of bare ground in the lawns. So one of the other things to note is that the majority of the bees that we identified, and in general, like 70% of all bees are ground nesters. And so having bare soil is so important. And so that's one of the things that, we did talk with the householders about, because they wanted they still wanted their whole yard covered with something. And just trying to explain, well, if you have some little patches, like that's going to be really good for bumblebees because they need to get in there, and like trying not to have too much mulch. Bark mulch is that's another thing that's a little bit difficult for some of these ground nesters to kind of make their way into the ground for nesting. So there's like a whole bunch of other things that we can do for our yards to help support these birds and bees.
Great. All right, Susannah, thank you. Lots of really positive feedback as well that I just didn't talk about, but inspiring, great feed, great presentation, great science. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. As a Forest Service employee, this is a part of Susannah's mission to educate. So we appreciate her doing our talk today. And yeah, I hope it has been nice to see what attention this got. If you listen to the NPR program, you can just Google NPR and the habitat. How'd you say to do it, Suzanne? I did find
Yeah,
it that
so I
way.
think I think if you do mine, like Google all things considered, my last name Lerman and Lawns. It was on the October 7th episode.
Yeah, it was
It
great.
was
And it
super
was,
fun.
yeah, it was fun. It's a great way to do it. So thank you for resharing. We're going to go ahead and go with our business meeting. So Susanna, I'll let you go. And thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Enjoy
Great.
the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Susanna. That was fascinating. I want to say one thing about the signage. It really is important and helpful to have a sign. It's a conversation starter. I have a pollinator pathway of Cape Cod sign at the end of the entrance to my driveway, my long driveway. And it not only explains why my garden looks the way it does, but then I can talk about it and people are interested in hearing about it. They ask about the sign, then you can talk about the importance of having a pollinator pathway, being a part of that. So I do think signage is great. I hope a lot of you had a chance to go to the spring symposium on Saturday. Is Mary on? Gary, did you notice the
I
Mary?
didn't see Mary, but Mary, if you
Yeah.
want to mute yourself and want to say,
Well, Mary, I see Debbie Anderson and several others
Yeah.
that were on
Carol's
the. Okay, thank you. I just want to say what a wonderful, wonderful day it was. Everyone, I think, very much enjoyed
Yeah.
the presentations.
Yeah.
And the hospitality, Cindy and hospitality committee. Thank you so much. It's so welcoming to go in and see the coffee and tea and treats. It really makes a difference. And you're always there. So thank you very much.
I just want
Mary-
to say that I appreciate that all Master Gardener groups came together to help with the symposium, but also this subject. I mean, I loved what our speaker said today, and it's one of our jobs to just change people's cultural views of what a lawn should be and what their yard should look like. And I think there's a momentum, and it's more than just a movement.
Mary, that is so true. I mean, I can remember walking around my old neighborhood in Maryland 25, 30 years ago and admiring some of the most beautiful green lawns in front of their houses. And now I truly look at a green lawn and feel like, ugh, think of the chemicals they must have used to
Right.
get that. I do not.
And still use.
I
Yeah.
do not find that attractive. And I think many of us are there. It's evolving, but I think many of us are there and many of us understand the importance and actually find beauty in a wild garden. So it was a perfect talk after Saturday Spring Symposium to hear the same message, but as Gary said, with all the science, additional science, I should say.
Exactly.
We heard science Saturday, we heard additional science today. So that was great. Gary, thank you very much for getting that wonderful speaker. Backyard Hort is over, and Betty and Barbara, thank you so much. And the team, I see Emily there, and so many people that gave talks for Backyard Hort, and it got rave reviews as always. So it's really an important program that we have. We have lots of announcements and updates from the committees. So demo garden, do we have Jean Hills here today? Jean.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes,
Yeah.
we're off and running. And it's so nice to walk into the demo garden this year and just see it's all new. I mean, finished that last year. It really looks good. We are hoping to have our first on-site demo garden day, on March 27th. Don't know what the weather's going to be. It may be just really, so
Yeah.
Brittany will send out an email in the morning if we have any changes in plans. which brings me to, if you aren't on the demo garden mailing list, the email list, please send your request to Brittany. It's on the registry there. We're looking for people, volunteers, especially, oops, being joined by a cat. We are looking also for volunteers to talk at our Evenings in the Garden program, which we are trying to. Last year was our experimental beginning season. Now we're into it. We are going to do one on May 7th, May 23rd, June 27th, August 8th, and September 5th. And these are basic gardening lectures. Anybody can attend. We urge master gardeners to attend, but we're just starting with getting your garden going, siting your garden, mulching, watering, plant care, managing pests, harvesting techniques. And then in the fall, we're going to get into crop covers, seed collection. So if you would like to volunteer to do a very short presentation, you don't have to do it alone. We can have people, buddy up to do them, but it would be nice to have a range of master gardeners to do that. And again, you can contact Brittany. She's our main contact point.
Terrific. Thanks, Jean. And the evenings in the garden at the demo garden are really so interesting and informative. I usually bring a neighbor with me. It's nice to bring a friend, a neighbor to see the beautiful garden. Was that it, Jean?
Yeah, it just yeah, I think that's basically it. If you just get involved or just be on the list so you know what we're doing.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Plant sale. Is Pam on? No? Okay. Does anybody else want? We've got.
Pam was driving from New Hampshire, and so she gave me the heads up that she may not be able to be on. So I wanted to hesitate to make sure she indeed was not. So I can go ahead. I know what note she wanted me to report on. Obviously we're in the full throes of growing for the plant sale, all of the different committees. We still need volunteers. We need volunteers for Ask a Master Gardener table. And we also need volunteers for cashiers. We need husbands and significant others to volunteer for parking for that day. So if you've got a significant other that would like to help out, we really could use that. And of course we need donations of perennials and natives. So get in touch with those committee people. They have people that'll come to your property and dig up any of your donations. So that's a great thing to increase our offering at the plant sale as well. And that's pretty much it. We're looking forward to it. Everything's going great.
Sounds good. Thank you. Speaking of perennials, Bill or Marilyn?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Michelle mentioned it, but the perennial team, is looking for plants. We all know that it's great to divide our perennials. If you've got perennials that need dividing, you can do it, or we can come and help. We need a large number of perennials for the plant sale. So it's a great help to us if you could participate. It's good for your plants and it's good for the Master Gardener program at Cape Cod. So we'll be sending out a communication that you can respond to. Marilyn and I, we've got a great team. We're excited about this year's sale and we'd love it if you could participate. So please let us help, or you can divide your perennials and contribute them to the plant sale. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Bill. Thanks very much. Children's Garden. Ken, I think I saw you.
I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you, Debbie. Well, the various committees for the Children's Garden have been very busy planning our 17th year of the Children's Garden, and we're quite excited about this year's program. Over the last 2 weeks, we've had 27 applicants families to apply for their child. And we have 17 openings, so we'll have the balance of that on the wait list. So we'll have 17 gardeners and 10 on the wait list. Right now we're scheduling a garden opening cleanup maintenance day, work day on the 5th of April, which is a Friday. And we're planning to distribute compost into the raised beds on that day and also plant the onion sets. We have an opening for mentors for the program. As you know, we have a mentor assigned to each student, an individual student and a raised bed for the summer program. And we still have an opening for a mentor. And we're planning to have our next committee meeting on the week of the 8th or the 15th, depending on whether we get information. We need information back from the parents to assign the students to a mentor. So look for an announcement of the next meeting for the week of the 8th for the Children's Garden.
Terrific. Thanks, Ken. So I was a mentor in the Children's Garden for the first year I did it. I just thought it sounded so wonderful, despite the fact that I live in Bourne and had to drive to Brewster every week. I enjoyed it so much and found it so rewarding that I came back the next summer. So I do highly recommend, if anybody is able and interested, let Ken know, Ken or Sue know. Thanks.
Yeah. If you're interested, please reach out to myself or Sue Carnathan for your availability. Thank you.
Thank you. Hydrangea Festival. Dave?
Hey, good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Hey.
We are set for 11 great days of garden visits, and we'll need plenty of volunteers. On April 15th, we'll post the volunteer sign-up sheet on the Master Garden Google Drive, and we'll send out a link prior to that. Secondly, we are bringing back tip talks in the garden this year, and we need a few volunteers willing to do a 15, 20-minute talk in the middle of a garden at 11 and 2 o'clock generally. Please let myself, Pat McDonald, or Eileen Gardner, or Ron Morissette know of your interest. I believe our emails are in March's newsletter. And lastly, in concert with today's program, we are promoting those gardens as pollinator pathway gardens that are on the garden tour. That information will be on the garden's description that'll be posted on the website. So great job today. Thank you, Gary, for coordinating that.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Thomas,
Yes.
Propagation Committee.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Thomas.
I'd like to start by thanking you all for your enthusiasm and support of the propagation workshops. And these are for you, the Master Gardener, to take advantage of, and they are considered educational credits as well. So you can take advantage of that aspect. The next one is this Thursday from 1 to 3 at the demo. I'm sorry, at the Hoop House, and Russ is the featured speaker. We also plan on introducing the show and tell, and this is where you have an opportunity to share your experience with something that you have propagated, using any method that you have. And this is important because it's showing, the whole thing is all about teaching and each other and learning from each other. And so the show and tell will give each of us that opportunity. And whether you actually bring the plant in or a photo of it, or simply just talk about it. That's all. That's what we're looking for.
Terrific.
April has 2 workshops. Thursday, April 11th and Thursday, April 25th, 1 to 3. May has no workshops, so that people can focus on the plant sale. But we do have a guest speaker on Thursday, May 30th. 12 noon is a potluck lunch, and the speaker is 1 to 3, and it's at the demo garden. And the speaker, I've known him for 30 plus years. He's second generation grower, and if you're looking for color for your garden nonstop, this is the man to listen to. And I'd like to just end by thanking the board for their support, in the hospitality committee, and Phyllis and Jack King for having, refreshments is always a plus. So
Absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. You are really on a roll. Your workshops are so wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's a team effort.
Yep.
Thank you.
I think we have just one more. Julie, did you want to say something about the herbs? You have to unmute.
Okay, there. So
Good.
the herb group is a transplanting this Monday and on Wednesday. And what we're looking for now will be people who can come once a week to the greenhouse between now and the plant sale to check on the herbs and to water them. So I'm looking for people who can commit to 1 day a week for the next 7 or 8 weeks until we get to the plant sale. And if you can do that, just get a hold of me. You'll find me in the directory, or you can get in touch with Deb Anderson, who is one of the people, is the co-chairs, or Virginia is the other co-chair, to let us know that you would be available to do that. But we really need waterers at this point.
Sounds good. Thanks, Julie. Anyone else have anything? Okay, lots of information, lots going on. Thank you, and we'll see you in April.
In person, everybody. We'll be back in person in April. And we'll be talking about biochar, an additive in your garden will be the presentation next time. And then we'll have May will be off, and we're hoping to be in the demo garden, a very unusual meeting style for us, in June. So more to come about that. But we'll see you all in April. I believe it's at Harwich. I should double check.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's Harwich.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thanks everybody. Thanks, Gary. So long. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.